I'll be your usher for the day, the virtual usher. I'm Olivier Clapin-Leblanc, the chair of the UK chapter of the Internet Society. So now next we will have Professor Lillian Edwards.
Hi, my name is Lillian Edwards. I'm Professor of Law, Innovation and Society at Newcastle Law School. And I've been doing quite a lot of work during the pandemic on privacy and digital rights as affected by COVID-19 technology. Particularly contact tracing apps. And interestingly, as I speak, the Scottish contact tracing app or proximity tracing app came out yesterday, which I'm very excited about as I live in Scotland. And the English NHS X app, they announced today, the day after, that it was going to come out September the 24th. So it is interesting times for COVID-19 technology. So let's talk about the impact on rights and how law might protect us or not. So as I say, what I'm going to do is talk, moving my head out of the way, is talk a little about three technologies. One is the state-sponsored contact tracing apps that we're now quite familiar with, that we've heard a lot about over the last 6 months. Such as the NHSX app and such as the other Google, Apple API apps that are now coming out quite regularly. But I also want to talk about what I see as actually two locuses for greater worry about privacy and rights invasion, which are what is going on with the unholy combination of COVID-19 surveillance technology and the workplace, and indeed the university campus, which have already been sites of fairly intense surveillance, technological surveillance. And what do we think about the move into what maybe used to be called immunity passports, but are much more likely now to be regarded as some newer extended form of digital ID, okay? So within the limited time we've got, I'm not going to be able to go into great detail about the impact on all the different rights, but I do want to say that although privacy is the one that tends to get the headlines, you know, in collection of personal data, we also should think about the fact that it's well known, lots of evidence, that extensive, invasive, often covert or non-transparent surveillance impacts on freedom of speech. It has a chilling effect. And it also, when we're talking about collecting location especially, has an impact on rights of assembly, of freedom of movement. So briefly, I'm not going to go through all this. We all know, I think, probably watching this, a little bit about the app saga over the last 6 months. So first of all, in England, I'm talking here about England and Wales, NHSX said that they were going to produce a centralized app that would collect data centrally, which was going to be the central tent peg of their world-beating contact tracing strategy. And as we all know, that didn't work out too well. Partly because of, well, two things really. Partly because of the loss of trust and confidence, because it was known, perhaps wrongly in some places, but it was known that it did collect a fair amount of personal data centrally. And secondly, because Google and Apple announced their protocol, which was based on this decentralized, more privacy-preserving model, where the personal data is kept on your phone locally, and only ephemeral, non-identifying identifiers are shared centrally. So essentially with the Google Apple protocol, there is no central storage of future mass surveillance proximity data. So the net effect was that most countries in Europe, though not all, completely all, have pivoted to the Google Apple protocol. And this creates generally greater trust. It gathers less data. It also means that centralized apps such as the Old English app actually don't work very well with it. You know, so you've got this practical problem of being pushed into using the Google Apple API. So we're now at the point where various places in the United Kingdom, such as Northern Ireland and Scotland, as I mentioned, have now produced Google Apple compatible apps. England have now announced that theirs is coming out. Sorry, my computer's playing up a bit today. That theirs is coming out September the 24th. So what's the effect now on digital and user rights of the new generation of apps? And the effect is that not that much, it's good. I was one of the lead drafters of that bill that you can see to the left, which was really designed in worries that there wasn't sufficient legal protection from data protection alone for the previous NHSX centralized app. But with the pivot to the decentralized app, as I say, there's considerably less danger of personal data being collected, retained, data mined, shared by the state, perhaps to private sector individuals. So we have to ask, what are the key remaining issues really now, at least with the UK? So the remaining worries, which are also mentioned in the draft safeguards bill that my team and I drafted, I think are two, right? One is maybe more hypothetical, but one is real, yeah? So the first one, I think, is that it would be helpful if we had a statement in law, or at least in very formal guidance or some kind of code of conduct, that the installation of an app, the download of an app, should always be voluntary. Because we know that there is 70 to 80% of the population, and it varies by age group, that don't have smartphones or are not very comfortable with using them, and perhaps would leave the house without Bluetooth turned on, etc., etc. And therefore it would be insane and discriminatory on grounds of age, race, poverty, all kinds of things, if people were to be penalized in any way for not installing the app or not having a smartphone. Now, I think within, you know, what is ostensibly a society that obeys the rule of law, which we are meant to be at the moment, no one expects that this would ever be an issue. But I do think in terms of engaging trust and confidence, which is what you need to get a population uptake of contact tracing apps, it still would be helpful to say that, okay? But the second bullet point here, sorry, got a lot of gremlins today. The second bullet point here is the important one, I think, which is that with any app, whether it is indeed a centralized app or a decentralized Google Apple API app, you could have issues about coercion and discrimination related to, are people going to be compelled to install the app, perhaps to get into their workplace, I think is the most proximate use case, yeah? And there has been talk of such things. Again, you might imagine that the impact here would be variable according to class, race, age, all kinds of features. So for example, you can imagine in the 0 hours economy, the precariat, the gig economy, that you could imagine that Uber already, for example, exerts a great deal of coercive control over its workers via its app and segments them according to which shifts they get. Are they the more profitable shifts? How fast are they supposed to drive from place to place? You could imagine similar controls being exerted to say that they have to have a state app in some way. Or alternately, it could be the other way around. And this is beginning to look more likely, actually, which is that some workplaces, you can imagine kind of garment workshops, for example, which might be flouting social distancing laws, but they might say, you're not allowed to come in if you have installed the app. Or we're going to say that you're not allowed to obey any warnings on your app because that might result in closure of the whole workplace. And clearly that's what you'd like. So these are both worries. Existing law doesn't really seem to cover either of these very well. In terms of discrimination, as in exclusion from the workplace, perhaps, or other public places, you might look at existing equality law in the Equality Act 2010. But if you look to the right of the slide, you'll see that the Equality Act only gives you protection from discrimination on the ground of a protected characteristic. And they are carefully limited lists. And they don't include health. And they certainly don't include any status as an infected or potentially affected person. It does include disability, but I very much doubt that this would fall into that category. There's also the possibility of arguing that there's indirect discrimination if, as we know, certain racial groups are more likely to become infected or to suffer bad consequences as a consequence of becoming infected. Then we could argue that their exclusion from the workplace was based indirectly on the protected characteristic of race. But neither of these are really arguments I would like to be in the position of making. So I think this is an area where we need to address some concern. What I do find a heartening development is that in the recent apps that have been coming out in the UK, the Scottish and Northern Irish app, there is a much more professional, I would say, approach to carefully publishing not only a data protection impact assessment, but also the equality impact assessment, a human rights impact assessment. And the Scottish app that's just come out is also publishing an account of how it meets the Bear of Scotland duty, which relates to socioeconomic inequality. So these are all, I think, really positive developments. And I'd like to see that as a best practice guide for not just contact tracing apps, but all future COVID technology, including, you know, databases and repositories and dashboards used to assist in the collection of health data and manual tracing data, manual track and trace data, which is probably the area we should now be much more concerned about than about the more overt, explicitly exciting technology of contact tracing apps. So I want to talk about two other areas that have maybe had less publicity. First of all, some of you might even have seen this. This was in the Times in June. I know you're not going to be able to read it all, although you can look at the slides afterwards, I guess, if you want to make it bigger. But this is just a privacy horror story, really. This was being presented as the Office of the Near Future, which includes, non-exclusively, smart doors that respond to your smart badges or lanyards, temperature testing, pervasive thermal infrared cameras, wearables that buzz when you're within 2 meters of somebody, contact tracing apps that are private to the workplace, which might include just within the workplace or out with it, might include visitors, perhaps, if they take on smart lanyards. It would include perhaps motion sensors, CCTV. There is an endless array of existing private sector workplace surveillance technology that is now being cleverly repurposed as COVID-19 technology. And this fits very nicely, these trends fit very well together as exacerbating trends of surveillance, yeah? So as I say, we already have this long list of types of technologies that were being used to intensively surveil people in the workplace, including CCTV, interception of your web and mail traffic, searching for your social media credentials, wearables as performance management, et cetera, et cetera. It also fits very well into the existing trend towards algorithmic profiling. You know, so we've seen again the gathering of as much data as possible so that we can tell automatedly how to hire, fire, promote, discipline. And these kind of developments, again, are all already rather dubious from a data protection point of view, I've argued in earlier work. But the reason why particularly I think this is important to look at is because while the contact tracing app wars had enormous publicity, the workplace surveillance is really flying under the wire a bit. Yes, it could be a much, much more dangerous locus, I think, for invasion of privacy and autonomy and movement rights. There are reasons here, very briefly, are these technologies, unlike the Google Apple app, and even unlike the previous centralized apps, are largely using highly identifying markers, such as, you know, they're using Wi-Fi hotspots, they're using RFID chips within doors, within lanyards, within smart cards, they're using thermal cameras and CCTV. So they're not in any way intended to be privacy preserving. Largely employees, especially again in the gig economy, the warehouse economy, the sweatshop economy, are not going to have choices about these. They're going to think it's mandatory or they'll lose their job. Again, that might not be quite true under both data protection law and labor law, but it's a very grey area. Is it when you're going to want to fight if you're, you know, a poor part-time worker? You're going to have very little control over the employer's policies in this area. It's about retention, security, transparency, data protection rights. But the key too, I think, at the bottom here, are that increasingly we don't just work from home. Home is where we live and work, you know, and therefore the work-life balance is becoming tremendously blurred. And if you are living in an existence where you're working from home and you're using things like Zoom or Slack or Teams or all the rest of them, how far is every step you take, every breath you take, being datafied, being recorded, being monitored? And what happens to the autonomy of your home life? If, as I did last night, I came in and sort of fixed these slides a bit at 2 in the morning, am I at work? Should I have all these kind of surveillance technologies on? Do I know how to turn them off? You know, what if it's the only laptop in the house? So, and the second really key point I think here is, having said that I think this is worryingly intensive and pervasive surveillance, is that there is much less restraint by data protection law within employment particularly than there is in general. And this refers to the lawful basis for collecting, sharing, processing data, where, you know, the employer will probably take consent. It might not be a valid consent, but they would still have legitimate interests as a lawful ground. And then you get to sensitive data, like health data or biometric data, and you go, well, surely people can't be compelled to share that. But they can, because there are exceptions for protecting health, by employers for the pandemic, which might mean that it's relatively easy to collect this kind of sensitive data in the workplace. And similarly, and this is very old law, it's not recent at all. Similarly, it's extremely easy with very little legal constraint other than giving notice for employers to intercept your workplace communications. In other words, to listen in on your calls, your social media traffic, your web searching, even your phones, perhaps when you're making calls on Skype or Zoom or whatever. So generally, this is a worrying scene, right? I won't go into that, I think, in a great detail. The sort of sub-example I wanted to give, because it's relevant perhaps to a lot of people watching who might be students or academics, is that the university campus is turning out very much to be the petri dish, the worked example of this kind of private sector surveillance. Sorry, I'm trying to pull my camera down so that you don't see it in the way. And we're already seeing this in the US, because the American campuses have opened earlier, and indeed their school campuses as well. We're seeing a vast array, rather as I told you about the workplace before, a vast array of means, thermometers, testing, Wi-Fi location, bracelets, wearables, everything you can imagine being pressed into use to surveil students on campus. And the point I really want to make without going into all of these are all measures that I've heard about from people recently in the UK, not just in the US. Is that obviously we have an interest in trying to keep the campuses open. Obviously we have an interest in not trying to spread infection beyond campuses and being able to lock down and test and trace. But there are more privacy invasive ways to do this, and there are less privacy invasive. And it would be worth thinking, what's the least privacy invasive way that will retain trust and confidence and will not just lead the students to avoid things by leaving their phones at home, leaving their bracelets at home, which is what they'll do. What's the most privacy preserving and trust inducing way we could do this? And there are a lot coming out. For example, in the news a couple of weeks ago, this idea that you could analyze the sewage or the wastewater, the poo, on a constrained area like a university campus and find out if the COVID-19 positivity was rising within that analysis. Similarly, I heard just the other day that if you had, say, people in a dorm, so not that many people, but more than one, you could pool their tests so that if you found out that one tested positive, then you could isolate the lot of them, say 20, 30, without the need to go through a test for each of them, which would be both more privacy preserving and more efficient, right? I mean, they were saying actually that's the only way they saw that as plausible to do. You can also have blurred CCTV. You can have heat maps on campuses of areas of more and high risk. And you can measure occupancy in buildings by measuring the CO2 if it's a smart building with those kind of sensors, which is something we're doing at Newcastle, looking into. So really, it just needs a bit of thought. And this is something I would really like the UK to be seriously thinking more about as we go into the autumn semester. So finally, I just want to talk in the last couple of minutes I've got, because this is more emergent, about where are we going with what maybe used to be called immunity passports. But the Ada Lovelace Institute introduced this phrase, which I rather like, public health identities, or PHIs, because we're kind of past the first stage of enthusiasm about immunity certificates, as I used to call them, or immunity passports, mainly because we've discovered that antibody tests aren't very reliable, and that even if we thought they were, that we're not very sure what kind of immunity they convey. So there's really been a kind of loss of faith in their accuracy and utility. But there does seem to be a revival of interest in the UK right now, I think driven by people like Dominic Cummings and Matt Hancock, who are keen on technology and big datafication approaches, towards being interested in, as it were, new forms of digital ID, which might include your health status, or might even include, and I know this is very scary, but there has again been various bits of academic evidence that this is possible, about profiling your risk as a health risk in terms of where you've been, who you've been in touch with, et cetera. And of course, that's more or less what the Chinese Alipay app was doing, which we think was very illiberal. So if we do develop such kinds of data IDs, digital IDs or health statuses, just to mention Matt Hancock just the other day again, when talking about the need for mass testing, possibly via imaginary technologies that haven't been invented yet. Again, he was talking about putting your evidence of how recently you've been tested on an app. And there was mention earlier, a few months ago, about health status as something that could be put on an app. So it's in the air. So why is this bad? Well, obviously, it could be discriminatory. It could stratify our society. It could create a race of the can go places and the cannot go places. It also has severe perverse incentives, in that if there are advantages to having this kind of health ID, then maybe people will try to obtain it by getting infected or placing themselves in risky positions. And that clearly is a very, very negative outcome. But I recommend the Ada Lovelace work here on public health identities. Thanks. That's me.
Wow, great. Okay, thank you very much for this. So we're now back to being live. And so Professor Lillian Edwards is with us. We've received a lot of questions here for you, Lillian, quite a number. And you've indicated that you'd like to sort of focus on specific ones. So maybe we'll start with those and then we'll go through the others if we still have time. I just had one question with regards to this contact tracing. Obviously, that's just what it is now for immediate contacts. But what about those people that come back from quarantine, come back from abroad and get put into quarantine? Is this app used for this as well? Could it track people around on this, or is it nothing to do with this?
No, can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
First of all, can I just say to everyone, I'm sorry that the slides were so invisible. They were visible when I saw them. No, that's not how the contact tracing app works, because that would be extremely privacy invasive. I mean, that would basically be a bug that followed you around all the time. And as I said to you on chat, that's useful, but in the West, we're not dead keen on that. Such quarantine apps were being used in places, I think, like China and Singapore and so forth. No, the state apps that we've been talking about, such as the NHSX app that's coming out shortly, or the Scottish app that's already out, basically detect anonymously your proximity to other people. And therefore, if someone tests positive, then the app will tell you you've been near someone who's infectious, and you've probably been near for 2 meters for over 15 minutes, and you should go and get tested. That's essentially what it does. It provides information about proximity. It does not follow you around in the way that you could do. You could do with Wi-Fi or with GPS signals from a phone, but that they've got a problem there about them not being very accurate. If you're in quarantine, you're probably not going to be in proximity to anyone very much, so it's not going to be any use at all.
Okay, right. Well, let's go. We're kind of short for time. So let's go down to the questions that we received. So there's one from Neil Fairbrother. Many young children have smartphones, and children are regarded as a virus vector. Is the treatment of their data and information subject to different laws or regulations from adults' data? And if so, how does the contact tracing app apply these?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I could talk about that for hours. As someone who used to teach child law, actually, it's particularly interesting. Essentially, I think the easy way out of this, that the Scottish app, and I don't know if the English app is going to do it, but I think the Scottish and the Northern Irish app have done, is they've said it's not for kids. You know, you're just not allowed to use it unless you're over 16. And the reason for that is because it avoids a kind of legal morass, because children under 16 may or may not have the legal capacity to consent to the sharing of their data, or even to sort of consent to, you know, this type of medical technology. It might be seen as a type of medical treatment, right? And that still takes you into consent, even if you're not thinking that you're sharing personal data, which would be the argument with the Google, Apple apps. And therefore they've avoided that entirely. The Data Protection Act chooses, I think, 13 as the age for England at which a child can agree to share data. In Scotland, it's even worse. It's a variable standard, depending on whether the child is mature enough or not. And so this is really a very difficult area. And certainly the apps I know have chosen to do this by avoiding it. It is a shame, because what you want for contact tracing is to have as many people in your population as possible with the app, you know, so that you get coverage, so that the proximity tracing starts to work well. And getting all the kids involved, at least say over 12 maybe, would be a big help to that. So I think it is something that needs to be thought about a bit, you know, and lots of kids over 12, I think, could have what we call Gillick competence. They could have enough maturity to understand what they're doing. And the risks to them are low and the advantages are high. So I don't see why it actually couldn't be legitimate, but it is quite legally tricky.
Okay, thanks for this. Now, the next question is from Andrew Cormack. And the question is, I've been wondering if blurred CCTV could be used to spot and fix office bottlenecks. Might it be a privacy preserving purpose and technology?
Yeah, this is again a really interesting question, and it gives me a chance to do a blurb actually for Newcastle, where I work, where we have a project kicking off looking at exactly this kind of theme. So we work in a smart building, or some of the people do, and it has already got CO2 sensors, air pressure sensors, temperature sensors, that kind of thing. And we're actually working to try to develop trained algorithms that might be able to extrapolate from these measurements. Say, is a corridor getting too busy? Is the entrance and the exit to the micro lab getting congested, right? And this is, again, a more privacy preserving way of doing this. And therefore, and this is always the point, more trustworthy for students than, say, taking all the very identifying data off their smart card readers, yeah? And not everyone has a smart card, and not every door has a smart card reader, yeah? So it's putting in huge amounts of infrastructure. Indeed, we had computer problems last week in Newcastle that knocked out all our smart card readers and smart card doors, apparently. So if we had this kind of assessment via, say, CO2, we still could go on assessing occupancy, congestion, and perhaps with blurred CCTV, we might also be able to do something about assessing social distancing without the very invasive apps that we've seen people rolling out, you know, where you're basically, again, wearing a bug all the time, right? That's the kind of commercial ones that have been coming out. So yeah, I think that's a really big area to look at. There's more on the campus slide about that you couldn't read.
Okay, well, thanks very much for this. I've been told by the powers that be that we're running out of time, and I see so many questions here. Would you be able to answer these later on, perhaps in writing or something, as a post UK IGF thing?
Yeah, I could try quickly, okay. But I'll try, and I can share the slides, right? That's no problem. In fact, I sent them yesterday.
Yeah, it's just taking a bit more time. Now, the slides indeed will be shared. I know that we had a problem with reading the slides, and I understand that we're going to try and do something to make them a little bigger for the future sessions, and also make the slides available. They should be, unless a presenter asked for the slides not to be made available, they will be made available on the IGF, UK IGF website. So thank you very much for joining us on this thing. We could clearly devote a couple of hours to this rather than this short amount of time. And well, it's very much in the news. So let's, you know, thank you. And let's, unfortunately, having to move on. Now, we're going to have a...
Is someone going to save the chat questions? Because I don't have access to save it. I've just checked.
Okay, yeah, I think again, the powers that be that are all powerful will do what needs to be done. So,
Thank you.
so thank you.